he had to turn his attention to the small matter of Carinus. You know, the sitting Augustus back in Rome. This problem he set about solving by issuing proclamations that Carinus was actually a hated and debauched tyrant who maintained his position through fear and violence. It was thus Diocletian's responsibility, and the responsibility of any Roman with a conscience really, to march on Rome and depose the hated tyrant. Whether or not any of this was true is highly debatable, especially since, again, Diocletian had 20 years at his disposal to firmly cement the idea that he rose to power as a divinely appointed defender of Roman freedom, rather than as just another power-hungry general. Diocletian needed a villain, and Carinus fit the bill. The villain in question, though, was not at all prepared to simply roll over for this upstart captain of the bodyguard. As soon as he learned that the men under his brother's command had decided to not simply transfer their loyalty to him, Carinus gathered up his own army and marched east to meet the army marching west under the command of Diocletian. While passing through Pannonia, Carinus apparently dealt with an uprising led by the local garrison commander and easily put the clamp down on any seditious activity. He then continued east with all deliberate speed, intent on preventing Diocletian from claiming any more territory than he already had de facto control of. The two armies finally met in Moesia in July of 285, and at the outset, it looked like Carinus was going to put down Diocletian's insurrection as easily as he had put down the one in Pannonia. In a series of short engagements, Carinus repeatedly got the better of Diocletian's men, and up until the decisive battle of the Margus River, it looked like Diocletian, whatever his political skills, was about to get thoroughly outgeneraled. But then Carinus was betrayed, and everything fell apart. The first explanation we have for Carinus' fall is that Diocletian had used those amazing political skills of his to induce Carinus' army to defect just prior to the battle. Backing this theory is the fact that Carinus' Praetorian prefect, the man who would have been most able to induce a defection of that magnitude, was kept on in his post after Carinus' fall, and you have to figure that he did something to secure that kind of treatment. The other, more salacious story is that a tribune who harbored a personal grudge against the emperor because Carinus had seduced his wife assassinated him, just as Diocletian's army was about to be defeated, instantly turning the tide of the whole battle. Remember when I said that the death of Victorinus sounded like maybe it was made up because the whole jilted underling trope was a common one in ancient literature? Well, here's another example of that. One way or the other, though, at the end of the day, Carinus was dead, and Diocletian stood tall as the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. As with his brother, we really don't know how old Carinus was when he died, but he had been Augustus for just about 2 years. His death, for all intents and purposes, marked the end of the crisis of the 3rd century. But as I mentioned earlier, no one knew it at the time. Diocletian was, at that point, just another usurper, and frankly, they were a dime a dozen these days. Next week, though, the Roman world will begin to realize that in Diocletian they were dealing with something else entirely. From the very beginning, his reign would prove to be a radical departure from what had come before him, and by the time he was done, almost every part of the Roman order, political, economic, social, military, would be transformed by the novel new policies of Diocletian. Ironically, though, Diocletian transformed the Roman Empire, not because he wanted to build something new, but because he wanted to restore something old. And welcome to the History of Rome, Episode 122, Jupiter and Hercules. I think it's fair to say that for the last 50-odd years, the Roman Empire had been flying by the seat of its pants. Emperors would appear on the scene, run around madly trying to deal with whatever that week's crisis was, and then pass the baton off to the next man, who would run around madly trying to deal with the next week's crisis before passing the baton off to the next man, and so on and so on. Improvisation was the order of the day, and if anyone even had a long-term strategy, they usually had neither the time nor the resources to put it into action. Most of the emperors who ruled during the 3rd century had no idea that they would even be emperor a year before they found themselves draped in the purple. Sometimes not even the day before. So it's not like these men were bringing with them carefully laid out plans when they took over power. But by all accounts, Diocletian was different. He had been thinking about it. He had thought long and hard about the problems facing the empire and what he would do if he had the chance to solve them. This is not to say that Diocletian was immune from the twists and turns of fate, and he was forced to improvise with the best of them. But he at least had some broad notions about the direction the empire needed to go in, and he did his level best to keep the empire going that way. And after defeating Carinus in 285 AD, he wasted no time getting going. Right away, Diocletian set the tone for the kind of administration he planned to lead. Elites across the empire always viewed transitions of power as incredibly dangerous periods of time. Who knew what kind of purges the new emperor would initiate as he set about consolidating his power? But right from the get-go, Diocletian made it clear that clemency would be his watchword. Not only were there no executions or banishments for Carinus' allies, Diocletian actually kept on most of the previous regime's magistrates. But just as the relief was taking hold, the elites in Rome couldn't help but miss the other big signal Diocletian sent them. He would not be coming to the capital anytime soon. Diocletian had no interest in acknowledging even the symbolic power of the Senate, and though the frontiers were mostly quiet, and he could have made the trip easily, one of the things he'd been thinking a lot about was that Rome needed to be removed from the political equation. The snubbing of the ancient capital was deliberate and permanent, and part of Diocletian's long-term project to wrest imperial legitimacy on something other than the consent of the long irrelevant Senate. The other big idea that Diocletian had firmly in the front of his mind when he came to power was that the job of emperor was now, without a doubt, too big a job for one man. At its core, the problem lay in the tension between external and internal threats. In order to ensure his place on the throne, an emperor has to keep with him at all times the largest and strongest army around. That way, ambitious generals elsewhere would not be able to muster any serious threats. But that meant that any significant external invasion had to be met personally by the emperor, since he was the only one with an army big enough to face it down. That meant a lot of running around for the emperor and a lot of borderland left unguarded as he ran from here to there. It also meant that these invasions were not being met in anything even resembling a timely manner. Diocletian had thought about this seemingly intractable problem, and finally came to the conclusion that there just had to be two emperors. Now this was not a novel idea, but previous examples of it had arisen out of dynastic concerns, going back to the partnership of Augustus and Agrippa that was initiated most of all because Augustus had almost died without there being a capable heir in place. Fathers and sons would rule together, or brothers would rule together to cement a family dynasty, but never before had the idea of co-rulers been premised on the simple notion that more than one emperor was actually needed. In these days, Diocletian recognized that more than one ruler was needed. The basic logic of this solution was simple. Two emperors operating over different spheres would each be able to respond to problems in their territories far quicker and more efficiently than any one emperor would ever be able to do. It would also, by splitting the load of administrative paperwork, create a far more efficient bureaucracy to deal with all the minutiae of governance. Some questions can only be answered by emperors, and with 2 emperors, twice as much can be answered twice as fast. Finally, and this is where the whole thing could unravel, Diocletian bet that by investing a colleague with imperial authority, that command of the huge array of armed forces that would come with that promotion, a huge array of armed forces that were needed to keep the empire stable, but that would not go to said colleague's head. They would already have all the dignity and power of an emperor, so no reason to rise up in revolt after winning some victory out on the frontiers, right? The question then became, who in the world could be trusted with such a promotion? Diocletian needed another imperial army out in the field, and he needed someone capable of leading it. And since he had no son of his own, he needed someone from outside his family whose loyalty he could absolutely count on. Enter Maximian. The man who would become known as Marcus Aurelius Valerius Maximianus was born around 250 AD near Sirmium into a family of shopkeepers. He was 5 or 6 years younger than Diocletian, which meant that they were just close enough in age to have essentially risen through the ranks together, but just far enough apart to be a partner. As with most of the Illyrian generals, the bulk of Maximian's early career is obscure, but it is almost certain that he was leading troops during Carus's eastern campaign, and highly likely that he was on hand for the drama of Numerian's death and the decision to elevate Diocletian. Depending on how far in advance Diocletian had been making his plans, it is entirely possible that he had been cultivating a friendship with Maximian for years, with the idea of appointing his junior colleague to share the purple with him if he ever got the chance to become emperor. Maximian was a good general, a stern disciplinarian, and a competent administrator. All of these traits recommended him to Diocletian, but perhaps more important than what Maximian brought with him to the table was what he didn't. Maximian had no native political talents to speak of. Elevating another man with a political mind might cause the new imperial partnership to devolve into mutual scheming, backbiting, and then, inevitably, civil war. But by choosing a blunt soldier who had no time for political machinations, Diocletian could be assured that he would have a partner in power, not a rival for power. The rapidity with which Maximian was promoted following Diocletian's elevation means that most likely all of this had been prearranged. Whether it had been arranged years in advance, or whether it was the final carrot used to secure Maximian's support following Numerian's death, is unknown. But we do know that immediately after the death of Carinus in July of 285, that the imperial entourage traveled to Milan, where, in a solemn ceremony, Maximian was elevated to the rank of Caesar, and formally adopted by Diocletian. The empire now had 2 capable men of imperial rank to watch over its domains. And it was a good thing that it did, because there was no time to sit around basking in the glow of newfound imperial luxury. There were things to be done. Diocletian had already determined that he was going to leave the new Caesar Maximian to handle the West, and in particular the troubled province of Gaul, while he himself traveled east so he could secure the Danube frontier and be ready for any fallout from Carus's previous invasion of Persia.